What would you do if your car disappeared overnight, not stolen, but towed away by a homeowners association you don't even belong to? That's exactly what happened to me, and the explanation I got was so absurd, so infuriating, that I knew I couldn't just let it go. For context, my girlfriend Emily lived in one of those cookie-cutter townhouse communities governed by an HOA. The place itself was nice, but parking? A nightmare. Ironically, as a visitor, I had it easier than actual residents because they had designated guest parking spots with hanging permits. I visited Emily once or twice a week, usually arriving Friday evening and leaving for work Monday morning. For 7 months, this arrangement worked perfectly, until one Monday morning in March, when I walked outside and my car was gone. My first thought? Someone stole my 2013 Honda Civic. I mean, who steals a beat-up, manual transmission Civic these days? Trying to stay calm, I called Emily, who was already at work. "Babe, I think someone stole my car." "What? Are you sure? Check the towing sign at the entrance." That's when my stomach dropped. Towing? No way. I had a valid permit, parked exactly where I was supposed to, and wasn't blocking anyone. But sure enough, after some frustrating phone calls, I learned my car had been towed at 6 a.m. sharp, courtesy of the HOA. The retrieval fee? $150. Seething, I called the HOA office, where I was put on hold for 20 minutes before a woman named Barbara answered. Her voice carried that distinct tone of someone who relished enforcing rules no one else cared about. "Yes, your vehicle was towed for visitor parking abuse," she said, as if explaining to a misbehaving child. "Visitor parking abuse?" She sighed, as if this was obvious. Section 361 of our bylaws states that visitors may not park in designated visitor spots for more than 72 total hours. Total? My pulse quickened. "Wait, you mean 72 consecutive hours, right?" "No," Barbara replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "The cumulative time a visitor parks here cannot exceed 72 hours, whether consecutive or not. And according to our records, your car has far surpassed that limit." I almost dropped my phone. They were keeping a running total of every single hour I had ever parked there? Over months? Exactly how do you know that? I asked, already dreading the answer. "Walter, one of our board members, has been tracking your vehicle. He keeps detailed records. A spreadsheet." Walter had been logging my parking habits, down to the hour, for months. That wasn't just strict, it was downright creepy. I wasn't going to let this slide. I needed answers, and more importantly, I needed my money back. The moment I got my car back, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't letting this go. This wasn't about the $150 towing fee anymore. It was about the principle, about some retired HOA board member thinking he had the right to stalk my parking habits like a mall cop on a power trip. If they could get away with this nonsense, what else were they pulling on the residents who actually lived there? I spent the rest of the day researching HOA bylaws and checking forums where people vented about HOA overreach. Unsurprisingly, I found plenty of cases where HOAs twisted vague rules to fine residents into submission. But my case? This was next-level insanity. Nowhere in the bylaw did it specify that the 72-hour visitor parking limit was cumulative over a lifetime. It was a complete fabrication, probably dreamed up by Walter, the self-appointed parking police. That's when I saw the notice. Emily had it pinned to the fridge, an upcoming HOA meeting scheduled for Wednesday evening at the community clubhouse. Perfect. When I told Emily I was going, she looked concerned. "They're not going to refund you. You know that, right?" "I don't care. I just want to watch them squirm when they try to justify this." Wednesday evening rolled around, and we walked into the most depressing excuse for a meeting space I had ever seen. The clubhouse looked like a DMV waiting room, cheap beige carpet, flickering fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of stale coffee. About 15 residents were seated in stiff plastic chairs, facing a table where 5 board members sat. And there, in the middle, wearing a tan polo tucked into khakis, was Walter. The meeting dragged on for 30 minutes before they finally opened the floor for resident concerns. I stood up immediately. My name's Jake, and last week, my car was towed from visitor parking even though I had a valid permit. I was told that the 72-hour limit is cumulative, over months. Can someone explain how that makes sense? Barbara, the HOA manager, adjusted her glasses and smiled like she was about to explain taxes to a 5-year-old. Our bylaws state that visitor parking is limited to 72 hours. You exceeded that limit. Not consecutively, I shot back. You guys are adding up hours from months ago. That's not how any normal parking rule works. Walter cleared his throat and pulled out a thick folder, flipping to a printed spreadsheet that looked like it belonged in an FBI investigation. According to my records, he said, pushing up his glasses, your vehicle has been parked in visitor parking for 892 hours over the past 7 months. That exceeds the allowed time. I blinked. You logged every hour I parked here? For 7 months. Walter nodded proudly, as if he had solved a murder case. Yes. Emily, sitting beside me, gasped in disbelief. I turned back to the board. So, if someone visits their friend for 1 hour every week, after 73 weeks, they're permanently banned from parking? Barbara didn't even blink. Rules are rules. Emily shot up from her seat. You're twisting the meaning of this rule. It's supposed to stop people from living in visitor parking, not to ban actual guests. The room murmured in agreement. A few residents nodded. Someone in the back muttered, "Yeah, that's ridiculous." Walter looked annoyed but waved his hand dismissively. The rule is written clearly. If you have a problem, you can file a formal complaint. Oh, I was way ahead of them on that. Great, I said, arms crossed. Then I'll see you in court. Walter smirked, but something flashed across his face, nervousness. I had no doubt that this wasn't the first time he pulled a stunt like this, but it might be the first time someone fought back. The board took a quick vote, 5-0 against reimbursing me, and adjourned the meeting. But the second I walked out, I heard Walter whispering to another board member. These young people think they can do whatever they want. He needs to learn a lesson. Oh, buddy. I think you just taught yourself one. By the time I got home that night, I had already made up my mind, I was taking them to court. Not because of the money, not even because of the ridiculous rule they had just made up, but because people like Walter and Barbara thrived on scaring others into submission. I wasn't about to be another resident who just rolled over and let them win. The next morning, I started researching small claims court. A friend of mine, Jason, worked as a paralegal, so I called him up to see if this was even worth pursuing. When I explained what happened, he burst out laughing. Dude, that's one of the dumbest HOA interpretations I've ever heard. Yeah, you can absolutely sue them. Small claims court is perfect for this, filing costs are low, and you don't even need a lawyer. That was all I needed to hear. I paid the $45 filing fee, filled out the paperwork citing unreasonable bylaw interpretation and predatory towing practices, and officially served the HOA. Then, things got ugly. 2 days after filing, Emily texted me a picture of a bright orange violation notice taped to her front door. It was a fine for $50 for, get this, excessive foot traffic in common areas. What the hell is this? I called her immediately. No clue, she said, voice shaking with anger. I walked to work. That's literally it. 2 hours later, she got another HOA violation, this time for an unauthorized vehicle in resident parking. But her car had been parked in the same assigned spot she'd had for 3 years. They're trying to mess with you, Jason said when I told him. It's retaliation. Keep track of every fine, they're digging their own grave. That was confirmed when I woke up the next morning to find my car towed. Again. But this time? It wasn't from visitor parking. It was from Emily's assigned resident spot. I was beyond livid. When I called the towing company, they said the HOA had flagged my vehicle as unauthorized. I knew exactly who was behind it. But they made a mistake. A neighbor had security cameras facing the lot, and when I asked to check the footage, guess who was on video? Walter. Walking up to my car, taking notes, and then making a phone call, the same call that led to my car getting towed. I printed the footage screenshots, stapled them to my court documents, and waited. 3 days before the hearing, the HOA tried one last desperate move. Barbara sent out a mass email announcing a clarification to the parking bylaws. Visitor parking was now restricted to 24 consecutive hours. I laughed when I read it. They were trying to retroactively justify what they did, but the problem? My case was already filed. Their new rule meant nothing in court. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. When I walked into the courtroom, I was met with a smug-looking HOA lawyer in a navy blue suit. The board must have been panicking, because they hired actual legal representation, which meant they were spending way more than the $150 they owed me. I presented my case clearly. I showed the original bylaw, pointed out how nothing in it said anything about cumulative parking hours, and handed the judge the security footage of Walter calling the towing company after stalking my car. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that the new rule supported their case, but the judge actually laughed. "So, you changed the rule after you towed his car?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. The lawyer fumbled. "Well, the intent was always the same." The judge held up a hand. No. Let's clarify something. If someone parks for 1 hour a week, in about 73 weeks, you're telling me they'd be permanently banned from visitor parking? The lawyer paused, like he just realized how insane that sounded. "I suppose, technically, yes." The judge chuckled, shaking her head. "That's not how rules work." A few minutes later, she ruled in my favor. The HOA had to pay me back my towing fee, my court costs, and a small additional fee for their shady practices. But the best part? As their lawyer explained the ruling to them, I turned around just in time to see Walter's face go beet red. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt vindicated. It wasn't about the money. I would have spent 10 times that amount just to see the look on Walter's face as he realized they had lost. The HOA lawyer didn't even try to argue after the judge's ruling. He just shook his head and muttered something about unreasonable expectations of compliance before storming off. I thought that would be the end of it. I had won, my money was refunded, and the HOA had been publicly humiliated in court. But karma? Karma wasn't done yet. The fallout started almost immediately. First, word spread through the community. A few of the residents had been at the hearing, and by the next day, the entire HOA message board was buzzing. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had been hit with questionable violations or ridiculous interpretations of HOA rules. My case gave them something they never thought they had before: hope. It wasn't long before more residents started pushing back. A woman named Lisa, who had lived there for 5 years, reached out to Emily. She told us that she had been fined $200 the previous Christmas for excessive holiday decorations, because her lights blinked too brightly. The HOA had counted every single string of lights as an individual decoration to get around their own rule. Another guy, Mark, had been forced to replace his entire fence because Walter claimed the paint shade was too warm for the community aesthetic. Then came the real bombshell. A resident, someone way smarter and way more determined than me, decided to dig into the HOA's financial records. As it turns out, Walter had been doing more than just patrolling visitor parking like a wannabe sheriff. He had been misusing HOA funds for his personal benefit. One night, Emily got a text from Mark, telling us to check the community forum immediately. When we logged in, there it was, a leaked recording of Walter bragging about how he had convinced the HOA to pay for his own driveway repaving, claiming it was a necessary board expense. Even better, he had also gotten new security cameras installed at his house, funded entirely by HOA fees, while rejecting multiple requests from residents who had been asking for better community security for years. It was a disaster for the HOA. Within days, an emergency meeting was called, this time with way more than 15 residents in attendance. People were furious. They demanded a full audit of HOA finances, and when the dust settled, Walter resigned in disgrace. The official reason was personal health concerns, but everyone knew the truth. The entire board was under scrutiny now. But they weren't done being petty. After Walter slithered away, Barbara and the remaining board members made one last desperate, spiteful move. They went after Emily. A week after the HOA shakeup, Emily got an email from her landlord. At first, we thought it was just a routine notice, but when she opened it, her face went pale. "They're not renewing my lease." I grabbed the phone from her and skimmed the email, my blood boiling before I even got halfway through. It was vague, overly polite, and full of corporate nonsense, but the message was clear. The HOA had pressured her landlord into not renewing, under the excuse that she was causing problems within the community. "They can't do this," she whispered, voice shaking with anger. "They just did," I muttered. It wasn't hard to figure out what had happened. The HOA knew they couldn't legally do anything to retaliate against me directly, but Emily lived under their jurisdiction, so they went after her instead. They wanted her gone. The only silver lining? We had already been planning to leave. 2 months later, we packed our things and moved into a quiet, HOA-free neighborhood, leaving behind the mess that was unraveling in that community. As we drove away, Emily checked her phone and snorted. "You're gonna love this." She held up a screenshot from the community message board. It was a newly posted lawsuit, a class action suit against the HOA for predatory fines, financial mismanagement, and failure to operate in the community's best interest. I couldn't help but laugh. The house of cards was falling down. Months passed, and life finally felt normal again. No more bogus fines, no more paranoid parking logs, and no more bitter old men with clipboards watching my every move. Emily and I settled into our new place, a quiet neighborhood with no HOA breathing down our necks, and for the first time in a long time, we felt free. I had almost put the entire ordeal behind me until one day, out of the blue, I got a text from Mark, the guy who had helped expose Walter's financial misdeeds. "Dude, you're gonna love this." Attached was a blurry photo, but even through the pixelation, I could see it clearly, a tow truck hauling away a very familiar-looking silver Lexus. Mark sent another message. "Guess who parked in the visitor lot of another HOA and got towed?" I couldn't believe it. Walter, the same guy who had spent months obsessively tracking my car, the same guy who had argued that rules are rules, the same guy who had gone to absurd lengths to punish me for parking legally, had his own car towed. I almost felt bad. Almost. I found out later that Walter had moved into another HOA-run neighborhood after resigning from the board, probably assuming he could escape his reputation. But karma had other plans. Apparently, he had parked in the visitor lot overnight, and the HOA there had strict rules about overnight visitor parking, rules that, for once, were actually written and enforced fairly. No special treatment, no buddy-buddy system, no Walter secretly adjusting the bylaws to his advantage. Just his own medicine, served cold. Seeing that picture was the perfect ending to this saga. Emily and I had moved on, but knowing that Walter had finally faced the same treatment he had gleefully inflicted on others, that was the kind of justice you couldn't buy. Looking back, do I regret taking the HOA to court over $150? Not for a second. Sometimes, standing up to power-hungry people isn't about the money, it's about proving that they don't get to bend the rules just because they feel like it. But that's just my story. What about you? Have you ever had to deal with a petty, overreaching HOA or a nightmare Karen? Drop your worst experiences below. I want to hear how bad it really gets.